Hey nerds, what's up? Do we live in a post-literate society? By definition, a post-literate society is a hypothetical society in which multimedia technology has advanced to the point where the ability to read or write is no longer necessary or common. This means that all written word has been replaced with recorded sounds or pictures. By this definition, the obvious answer is no. I mean, it would be laughable to try to claim that today that writing is completely unnecessary or that reading is completely unnecessary. We read in almost everything we do to basically function in society. But that does not stop multiple blog posts, think pieces, even news sources from lamenting that we are approaching a post-literate society due to the rise of things like social media, video games, alternate and virtual reality, movies, TV shows, and other things of the type. So today we are going to discuss fear of change, what literacy and reading actually means, and how we will solve our dilemma if in fact we are approaching a post-literate society. See you after the jump. Now, post-literate societies are very common in a lot of famous dystopian literature. The best example of these probably being The Gutenberg Galaxy by Marshall McLuhan, Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury, and even Brave New World by Huxley. And this makes sense. Dystopian works, particularly ones that intend to make a social commentary, purposely push reality to extremes to help us better critique our own current worlds. However, this same tactic doesn't really work in the real world when we're talking about news articles or things assigning topics to our real life reality as it is now. And the biggest way I see this done is through the overuse of anecdotal evidence. When I started this research, the thing I found most common were tons and tons of news articles or blog posts talking about how the young generation is moving us towards this post-literate reality, but the biggest evidence they use were just stories from their own lives. Now, personal stories can be great to set a mood, or they can be moving or very important to a topic, but to act like single stories tell the entire picture for the entire world is obnoxious and misleading. I find it extremely laughable when a blog that's literally titled For Researchers and is a blog about how to properly research has an article on post-literacy that literally includes zero research, but rather a story after story after story from the author's personal life. Here are some examples. First, the author brings up a quote from a professor from a nearby college. It is unclear whether the author interviewed this professor or if it was from some other quote. I think it maybe was from some other news article, but here's what it says. The faculty at this college require less and less intellectual effort from the students. Students there have even lodged complaints against faculty who assign out-of-class reading and then dare to give failing grades on quizzes based on them. The post then goes on to lament about how the students are holding the faculty hostage and get angry at failing grades when the students themselves don't put in absolutely any work or know anything, according to the blog. It also goes on to compare a story about their personal 9th grade teacher who was a huge stickler for grammar and every part of a sentence and things being perfectly spelled, and then talks about how another teacher who just got hired at the school basically couldn't do anything and wrote incorrect words on the chalkboard and lamented on, isn't this the sad state of society that even teachers don't know anything anymore? As it quotes, how representative is the contrast between these two individuals when comparing generations of teachers? I'll link the article below if you want to read it, but my big issue is these stories are just one-offs. These stories are told as they personally happen to her, but are expected to be, well, this is what is happening absolutely everywhere. And they also seem pretty exaggerated. It's just, this is the evidence we have that we're in a post-literate society. This article in particular, but many of the articles I read of this nature, I can't help but feel like they come off as being fearful of the new generation and fearful of the world. They come off like the many people throughout history who were fearful of new technology or new things and thus repulsed by it because they did not understand it or understand the changes that were happening. There are many examples of this throughout history, but probably most famous is the one of Socrates and his pupil Plato. It is said that Plato wrote down these thoughts for Socrates because he was against writing. Now, the famous quote attributed to Socrates. I actually couldn't find anywhere in the actual translated literature, but this is what I could find. This is Plato transcribing a story with like moral at the end of it that Socrates said. For the invention will produce forgetfulness in the minds of those who learn to use it, because they will not practice their memory. Their trust in writing produced by external characters which are no part of themselves will discourage the use of their own memory within them. Socrates was literally worried about the written word. He was worried that once we started writing things down, we would no longer be able to remember anything because memory would become defunct. So yes, what I'm trying to tell you is that a famous philosopher, Socrates, was worried about the invention of something that we are now worried that we are losing today. Food for thought. Honestly, he wasn't the only one. There are quotes that are throughout history that are pretty late, decrying books and literature and the written word. Martin Lowry said, "Already abundance of books makes men less studious. It destroys memory and enfeebles the mind by relieving it of too much work." Rousseau on education said, "I hate books. They merely teach us to talk of what we do not know. No book but the world, no teaching but that of fact. The child who reads ceases to think. He only reads. He is acquiring words, not knowledge." It just seems hilarious to me that we are so worried about losing literacy today and talking about a post-literate society when, like, back in the day, people were terrified of literacy as being the death of thought. And we know of similar stories for every invention. There are tons of quotes about the invention of the telegraph and then the telephone, about how it would destroy all privacy. And now it's, focused on social media and gaming and whatever new thing. There has always been a fear of change, always a fear of the new. And so far, all the people who've decried them and said our civilization was ending, it hasn't happened yet. So at this point, you're probably like, is the whole point of this video to trash the idea of post-literacy? No. But we had to get that out of the way so that we could talk about how a lot of people's working definition of post-literate society just doesn't make a lot of sense and isn't really, I think, what people are fearful of. The problem with post-literacy, as defined by many of these blogs or like the real definition of it, is that I find it almost impossible in practice to come to pass. I mean, complain about video games ruining literacy all you want, but anyone who's actually played a video game knows that there is a lot of reading required. Like, how else do you think we know and buy our stats and know what's happening in the story? Like, not all games are voice audio. A lot of them just come down to written word. Even just like choosing what movie or TV show to watch at night, you have to have a basic sense of literacy to get there. And sure, maybe we can think of a world where our daily reading requirements are all replaced by pictures or audio, but then let's think about like science and engineering and math, these things that build our world, architecture. Is that really going to be a way to teach people or to build without anything written down? No numbers, no charts, no anything? Like, just even knowing our basic human desire to explore the universe, how would that be possible with only pictures and audio? I have a very hard time picturing that as a reality. Even if a computer did it all, somebody would have to program the computer. So we need to revise our definition of what post-literate society means. And to do that, we need to talk about what even is literacy. What is reading? This is something I honestly didn't put a lot of thought into until I was teaching my own son to read, because I think for a lot of our lives, we incorrectly assume that reading is just knowing a bunch of letter sounds and combining them in the correct way, and then being able to physically read a word. But as I was teaching my son to read, I learned it's more than that. It is not only decoding, which is the actual like sound of the word, but it is also comprehension. It is understanding what you read. It is being able to sound out the word and that know that at means a orange fluffy thing that is a pet. So there are two definitions I found that I think are a much better representation of what we kind of actually mean when we talk about a post-literate society. The first is from an article that I'll link below and show on screen, and it says, "A society becomes post-literate when electronic media compresses its experience of literacy to such an extreme degree that the simultaneity of the oral replaces the sequentialism of the typographic as the dominant pattern of thought and sense-making." Now, I do feel this quote is almost obscurely pretentious, but getting to the heart of it, it's not saying that literacy or reading or words go away completely, but rather that electronic media becomes the dominant way we think and consume, meaning there will be words and will be writing, but most people will not need this, for most of their decision-making and thought processes will be visual. This is a subtle difference, but I think it matters. And then there's the second definition, which is used by a lot of different educational agencies and research groups, but I think it is best summed up by the Program of of International Assessment for Adult Proficiencies. It says, literacy is the ability to understand, evaluate, use, and engage with written text to participate in society, to achieve one's goals, and develop one's knowledge and potential. AKA being able to glean enough meaning from what they read to be able to make decisions on what they've read, or understand a deeper meaning. Now, this second definition in particular is what I think most people are actually thinking when they talk about us moving into a post-literate society, or at least they should be. It's not just about decoding words or using language and writing, but it is about actually being able to parse and understand that writing in a useful and correct way to live life in our society in a meaningful way. So when people think about a post-literate society with this definition, it means they are worried people will get to the point that they will no longer be able to have the critical thinking skills to really analyze our world through the written word. Now, this is more interesting, and this is what we're going to be discussing from here on out. So now that we have a few definitions of illiteracy, let's talk about what's happening there. Are we as a society growing more illiterate? Do we have data to talk about and prove that? I'm going to be focusing on the US from here on out simply because that's where I live and it's easy to find data for that, but I'm sure you could find data for any country that you are living in. The National Center for Education Statistics, or NCES, has collected data from many different sources and studies about illiteracy, and they plot trends from 1870 to 1979. Based on this data alone, illiteracy rates have gone way down. But what about today? 1980, after all, was 40 years ago now, and before the invention of many of the modern ills that many assume are bringing about the post-literate age. Today, the NCES says that about 79% of American adults are considered literate. They then separate the 21% of illiterate adults into further categories. 4% of these individuals were considered below level 1, essentially meaning that they knew some vocabulary words and could pick out things they needed, but did not understand sentences or paragraphs. 12% were at level 1, which is defined as someone who can read short text and locate information that is identical or close to identical with information given in a question. There is a skill at recognizing basic vocabulary and understanding meaning of sentences. Making up the last 4% of our illiterate category were those unable to participate for various reasons dealing with their literacy, but they did not fall into either of the other two categories. Now, to save time, I won't define orally the other 4 levels of literacy that are considered literate, but it is interesting that there is a big difference. If you look at the definitions I've thrown up on the screen, along with the graph, you can see that even among the literate, our skills differ. This makes sense because I've often heard people throwing around the idea that most adults can only read at a 5th grade level. Now, before we dig into that, let's talk about these stats. Now, you'll notice that our 21% of illiterate adults in the USA in 2019 is alarmingly bigger than the data for 1979, which was 0.6% of adults being illiterate.
Oh no, we're in a post-literate society. Everyone sound the alarm.
Except there's one extremely important detail we've left out. The definition of literacy changed between our studies in 2019 and our studies in 1979 and before. Before 1990, literacy was defined as just the ability to decode language. There was literally zero emphasis on comprehension of language. If you could physically read the word, then you were good, you were literate, which is wildly different than the definition the NCES, which is where I got this data, uses now. Now it's all about what they call functional literacy, which is the ability to act on information that you read. Now, I think this is a great change and makes a lot more sense when we're talking about literacy, but it does completely skew the data from times before when they used a completely different definition of what literacy was. I mean, look at the data I just shared. If we use the old definition of illiterate, then all of the people that are considered illiterate now in those level 1 and below level 1 groups would probably be considered literate. How can we say illiteracy is growing because of social media when we literally don't have anything to prove that, or our definitions were different? I want to see the data proving this. Now, I'm not saying that it's not true. I'm not saying that it couldn't be true. I'm saying that we do not have the data to prove that it is true. Additionally, we even have other issues with that earlier data because the collection methods differed wildly. I looked into it. Sometimes they polled like only 100 people or something. Sometimes they polled a lot of people. Sometimes it was all just extrapolation data. They didn't even like poll anybody. It was just guesses. So it's even hard to compare the data to itself over the years. Also, just for a quick comedic relief, while I was trying to find the most accurate data about our literacy rates that I could, I came across a Gallup poll. Now, I thought Gallup was, more legit, so I was kind of looking into it. I did not really like their methodology, so I quickly got rid of it. But this was the article title on their research about illiteracy. I literally could not stop laughing. What is this title? Someone tell me. The irony. So, is our literacy growing in the digital age? I think we don't know. I don't think we have the data to prove that it is. I think that we can keep collecting the data as the years go on, and they probably are. But right now, I don't think definitively we can say an answer. Now let's talk about some other things that may play into this post-literate society idea. Over the years, I have heard many reports and studies talking about how most US adults read at a 5th grade level or below. And I actually worked for an educational company that focused on reading, so this was something they talked about all the time. Now I couldn't find like perfect stats on this, but I did find a lot of people agreeing that it's actually that most US adults read at an 8th grade level, which I do feel like is wildly different when you compare 5th grade and 8th grade reading levels. And it was only 20% of adults that read at 5th grade or lower, which definitely would not be considered illiterate in our previous data. So this isn't post-literate, right? It's still people reading, but I do think it gives credence to this idea that somehow our literacy is going down somehow. Somehow we are getting stupider. We are getting further away from this literary ideal. I've also heard a lot about our decreasing attention spans in the digital age. And I won't lie, this is something I've totally bought into previously. I'm like, oh man, look at me, like I'm watching a movie and I'm on my phone. Geez, I have such a bad attention span, and it's constantly being advertised like our attention spans are bad, mostly because of our phones and social media and the internet and the access we have to those things. Are you ready for this? It turns out that that is a freaking myth. The most famous quotation that's been spread on this, I know you've heard it, I've heard it a million times, is that our attention spans have decreased from 12 seconds in the year 2000 to only 8 seconds in the year 2017, which is the average attention span of a goldfish. Now, extremely valid news sources have reported on this. I'm talking Time Magazine, I'm talking The Telegraph, I'm talking The Guardian, I'm talking the New York Times, the National Post. People talked about this. Apparently, every single one of these news articles are referencing a 2015 study that was done by Microsoft Canada. But get this, the BBC did a deep dive on this, and they found out that that statistic did not actually come from that Canadian Microsoft study. It was sourced from a different source, a different citation. And they tried to track down this original citation. They contacted the company, they contacted everybody news agency who ever used this, and they could not find the original study. They could not find any evidence of original data. So we don't even know if our attention spans actually are decreasing. It might be a myth. I mean, we don't know, but what we've been fed isn't necessarily true. And this BBC article also brought up something else I found extremely interesting, was that our attention spans differ depending on the task. I mean, most of you guys who are probably on my channel are readers. We've all sat down and read for a really long time if a book captivated us without having to be distracted by our phones. We've probably sat down and watched something engaging. Maybe you're a DIYer and you've DIY'd something for hours at a time. It depends on task. Yeah, maybe if we're doing something a little bit more boring, we're in a boring lecture, maybe we are checking our phone, okay? But it's task dependent. I also liked this quote that this article brought up. Some also suggest that evidence of ever shorter shot lengths in films shows attention spans are dwindling. But the academic behind that research says all it shows is that filmmakers have got better at trying to grab our attention. Okay, so let's talk about the second portion of our functional post-literate society. And that is that people aren't able to parse or understand or critically think about information anymore. I think a lot of us have been frustrated before by people sharing idiotic things on the internet that are clearly not fact-checked, even harmless things that a feel-good story, and then you look it up and it's this never happened. Seems things like Facebook and Twitter are hot spots for this sort of thing. Another common one is that people share quotes from famous people and they get shared a million billion times, and the quote is totally inaccurate. I see this a lot for Einstein, Bill Gates, Edison, or Buzz Lightyear. It doesn't matter who it is. They share these quotes, they get shared a million times, and the person never said them. For heaven's sakes, a very Einstein quote that came up in my fear of change portion research for this video essay was a quote by Einstein I'd heard a million times. I decided to do some research. Turns out that Einstein quote is false. Someone made it up in 2012. That is the first time this quote has ever been in existence. So this for sure has to be a sign of our decreasing literacy in this modern digital age, right? Maybe. Hear me out for a second. Stuff like this has been happening since the dawn of time, just in different formats. Before the internet, before phones or telegraphs, Before anything, we still had like neighbor Bob down the street telling us falsehoods. We still had people making things up to make them feel self-important or to make a good story. And here's the deal. Back then, it was also harder to disprove. Sure, today we have much bigger platforms for misinformation, whether it is malicious or harmless. Things can be shared in literally a second and can reach thousands to hundreds of thousands to millions of people and perpetuate disinformation very easily. But on the flip side, we also have infinitely more resources to debunk that information. I mean, as much as people love hating on Wikipedia, studies from over the years, from 2005 to 2015, have shown that it has a similar rate of accuracy to very famous encyclopedias. And interestingly enough, can also be updated much faster to keep current with current events as they happen. Also, I just have to say, the irony of looking up Wikipedia's accuracy and the first 3 hits being Wikipedia articles about their accuracy is just, don't worry, I didn't use them as a source on themselves. Again, just back to our point that oftentimes new things are conflated with bad or wrong compared to the way something used to be done. And this has been true throughout history. I also find a lot of discourse around post-literacy in our society to focus blame on younger generations, particularly teens and younger. Kids today grew up with phones and will now only watch things, not read things. Kids spend way too much time on social media and don't know how to interact with people, let alone a book. Kids today don't know how to actually research anymore. They only know how to search the internet. Kids today use chat and text speech in their essays at school, and it's absolutely hopeless. These are all real examples that I read from blog posts and think pieces while researching for this video. Here's my 2 cents on that. I find zero evidence that what we talked about previously about shared misinformation and not being able to critically think about this stuff that we are sharing is only coming from the younger generation. In fact, I find it in my own life, which I know is a story, but I think everyone I've ever talked to can agree that the sharing of misinformation crosses generational lines. I see people of all ages sharing misinformation, just like I see people of all ages being good fact checkers. I mean, think of our classic Karen trope. If that is to be believed, like the Karen trope is of a woman, right? Probably 50s or higher, who regularly spreads misinformation. Like the literal trope is someone who is older, not young. Personally, I don't think age has anything to do with it, but I mean, plain devil's advocate, you could even make an argument that because the younger generation grew up with the internet and grew up with phones, they may be more technically literate and less likely to share misinformation. Also, this whole idea that came up again and again about kids using text-speech in essays and how terrible this is just literally the dumbest thing I ever heard. Let's do a quick little example. You guys, go pick any of my videos and look at all the comments that I've responded to. Look at the way I talk in my comment section. I use tons of text speech or chat internet speak. I say LOL, OMG. I use tons of emojis. I use exclamation marks, things that would not be okay in an essay. Well, guess what? I wrote a frickin' master's thesis, okay? It is something like 200 pages, okay, of engineering talk, of technical things. There is not an emoji in sight. There is not an exclamation mark. There is not an LOL in sight. It is almost like people can know the appropriate way to talk in different situations. It's almost like people are smart enough to know that you might send a different toned email to your boss than you would send to your mom. Shocking. I think I may be coming off more pro social media than I actually am. I actually have a lot of very strict media and internet rules in my household for my kids. Like my kids don't even watch YouTube. And for myself, I deleted all the apps of social media off my phone except for Instagram. And even that I put a time limit on. So it is not that I don't think there are problems with social media or that they do affect us in negative ways. That is not my intention. But I am merely focusing on social media as it relates to our literacy, which is a very specific and narrow question and does change how we look at it. So like, okay, if you're a parent or a teacher and you see kids using internet speak in a formal essay, instead of freaking out about it and lamenting about the end of this generation, why don't you just like talk to the kid and say, hey, this isn't appropriate for this situation. I think they're smart enough to figure that out. Maybe I'm being too optimistic, but I mean, I do know teenagers, and I have a hard time believing that kids today are so stupid that they can't realize there are different ways to talk in different situations. Like, schools are still teaching grammar and how to read, right? Like, at least my kids' schools are. Okay, fine, I don't have technical data on this, but like, from the way I've researched schools and elementary schools, it seems like they're still putting a pretty big focus on reading. So, are we in a post-literate society? I'm guessing by the tone of this video, you can tell that my answer is. The answer is no, we are not in a post-literate society. Now, this doesn't mean I don't find some trends or things in our current society concerning. Yes, I do think social media may play a part in our lack of critical thinking skills. It is so easy to take sound bites and be angry or inspired by things that don't have a basis, and it becomes so easy to be lazy and not properly research or look into the things that we're sharing. Yes, does this happen? Absolutely. But the world is going to change and technology is going to keep happening, and I think it is a weird take to automatically assume the worst about new technology. It may take some time for us to adapt, but it doesn't always mean that the world will be irreparably changed for the worse because something new has come about. And yes, I'm not going to sit here and argue that there's like a lot of aspects of social media that are bad for us, but I'm talking about just in the post-literary sense. I don't necessarily think that we have to be so worried that we can't maybe fix some of the issues that we've found with our new internet age. Yes, could these things spell a problem for our society? Sure, but we're not there yet. I don't think we're close to there yet. So if you are really worried about this and really worried about post-literacy, let's talk about things we can do to like reverse the trend. First, let's start off with the easiest person to change, which is ourselves. Let's talk about personal development. Are you worried about literacy and the ability to critically think and those things aren't there? Then challenge yourself. Pick a book that is longer than you normally read. Pick a novel that has really challenging vocabulary and have a dictionary nearby and look up the words that you don't know to try to teach yourself something new. Read a book that's known to have a deeper meaning or have a lot of metaphors or allegories, and then afterwards do the research to make sure you understood them all. Take a course on it. Look up a lot of the free resources online. Read an essay and see how you feel about it. Discuss it in a book group. Read something from a completely different genre than you usually read. Read a nonfiction that teaches you a lot about something you never knew about. Then there's my personal favorite recommendation that I give to a lot of people in my life, and they're probably sick of talking about it, but take a basic statistics course. There are tons of free things offered online through colleges, community college. I'm sure you could find something in your area if you wanted something more than that. There's even books or I'm sure YouTube lectures on statistics. This is the thing I always point to as the single most influential thing in my life when talking about how I consume data and information and how I fact check. I took an introductory stats course my first year at college, which was, like 12 or 13 years ago. And it changed everything about how I viewed information. It gave me an informational literacy that I did not have before, an ability to parse the statistics and studies that were so rampant in our society and understand and separate good data from bad data. And it is serving me literally to this day and started my lifelong affection for statistics. I ended up studying a lot of it through the rest of school just as a hobby. So I highly recommend it. People are afraid of statistics because they hear that and they think it is math. Introductory statistics is very, very little math. In fact, you could probably get a class that was no math at all. It is mostly vocabulary. So much so, in fact, that my university actually counted it as a second language course and not as a math course. I highly recommend. Also, fact check yourself before you click share. It might be a fun quote that seems harmless, but you could be a part of the solution by always making sure you look into what you share and post. Okay, and now what about in our communities? How do we make our communities better and farther away from this post-literate society? Well, the first, let's say you work with youth in any capacity, maybe as a teacher, maybe as something else. You could probably help by first not judging your students and instead being open and willing to teach them and talk to them about this sort of things. If you want them to have critical thinking skills, let them practice in a safe environment without judgment. Read challenging novels or read things that they're interested in today and talk about the deeper meanings. They can develop critical thinking skills by practice. Teens are so much smarter than I feel like a lot of people give them credit for. So maybe you don't work with the younger generation. You can make a difference in the workplace. Is someone sharing information that's a little suspect? Bring it up in a kind way and talk about how you fact check your own sources. Be an example of fact-checking and critical thinking skills. Maybe you start a book club where you guys read really challenging texts and talk about how to critically think about things and stretch yourselves in your communities. And if you're a parent and there's kids in your household, then be an example to your children. Make reading a priority in your home. Talk about the vocabulary words you read when you read out loud to your kids. Ask them if they understand what that word means and then tell them if they don't. Ask your kids questions about what you read out loud together. Ask them what they thought of the story, what they think this means, what they think is going to happen next. Be okay with telling your kids, I don't know the answer to that, but let's look it up together. Teach them that you prioritize research and thinking on your own. We aren't in some post-literate dystopia that's so far gone that we can't make big differences in our homes and communities. I do need to make an important note about literacy before we wrap things up here. In the US, illiteracy disproportionately affects low-income communities and people of color. This is due to inadequacy and inequality in many aspects, including schooling, housing, access to resources, and more, and also our country's history with racism. Illiteracy has been shown to have a huge effect on job security, income, health, and other life vital things as those. I didn't discuss these things in this video because I was discussing the general idea of a post-literate society and the assumed idea that everybody and all populations are participating in this equally and willingly. The fundamental idea of a post-literary society is that this is a society in which people have chosen to become illiterate because they prefer audio and visual and other mediums. I do not mean to imply that those who are actually dealing with illiteracy today have somehow chosen this position for themselves. These important social concepts were just simply out of the scope of this video. So what do you think? First, a thank you to the follower who gave me the idea for this video. They gave it to me months ago. I can't even remember what video the comment was on. I wish I could find it because I didn't write down who gave me this video idea, but if it was you, I hope you know who you are, and thank you for the idea. Second, what do you guys think? Do you agree with anything I've said? I was pretty critical about the idea that we live in a post-literate society because I do feel like a lot of the criticisms are so overblown and just have a lack of actual data to support them. But I would be super curious if you are on the other side of this argument and want to hard argue for us being in a post-literate society or even very close to going that way. I'm very interested to hear the arguments that you think I missed, or if I convinced you and you previously thought we were post-literate and now we're not, just let me know what you think in the comments below. I always want to hear it. And as always, if you like these kind of videos and want more of this, please like and subscribe. That is the best way you can support me. And if you want to see what I'm currently reading or chat with me or see other nerdy rants like what I thought of Dune, you can check me out on Instagram at bookborn.reviews. I'll see you next time. Bye.